It was the most important gathering to end Libya's conflict in many years. But from the start, German Chancellor Angela Merkel was struggling to narrow differences between Libya's rivals. Prime Minister of the Tripoli-based Government of National Accord, Fayez al-Sarraj, refused to sit down with warlord Khalifa Haftar, leaving Merkel shuttling back and forth to convince major powers to help secure a permanent ceasefire and stop the flow of arms into the war-torn country.
Everyone was in agreement, including the regional organisations, the Arab League, the EU and of course the African Union, that we need a political solution. It's become evident in the last few weeks that there's no chance for a military solution, which could only increase the suffering of the Libyan people.
The UN chief said the new diplomatic gains made so far boost the chances for a new political process owned and led by the Libyans.
We urge all Libyan parties to engage in a Libyan-owned and Libyan-led dialogue under the auspices of the United Nations, paving the way for a political solution to the crisis.
Despite the consensus among the participants at the conference, there remains huge disagreements. French President Emmanuel Macron called for an immediate end to foreign intervention. Paris has recently expressed concerns over Turkey's growing influence. But for President Recep Tayyip Erdogan, Turkey's role is crucial to end violence and prevent Haftar from capturing Tripoli.
We have been trying on a number of occasions to have a ceasefire agreement signed. The National Government of Accord signed a ceasefire agreement. Yes, it wasn't signed by the other party led by Haftar. If we fail to have a ceasefire in place and if we fail to have an agreement signed, we will never see Haftar's hostilities coming to an end.
Russia is also expanding its influence in Libya, but appears to be willing to team up with Turkey to ensure the ceasefire holds, even though both countries support opposite sides in the conflict.
We thank both the parties for coming to Moscow, as they both had heeded our calls and they had both responded to our demands of a ceasefire. Now we are in Berlin, we hope for more success in this particular crisis.
The US role has significantly diminished in the oil-rich country. The EU is divided. The French support Haftar, while the Italians back Sarraj. There were hopes the Berlin conference will bring all the parties that can end the conflict. But Tunisia was shunned from the peace talks after receiving an invitation last minute. Morocco, which hosted the 2015 peace talks, and Qatar, a key supporter of the GNA, were also excluded. The Berlin conference was essentially about relaunching political dialogue. Libyan rival groups will meet in Geneva in the coming weeks to see if they can form a new government or risk turning their country into a permanent playground for foreign intervention. Hashem, Aljazeera, Berlin.
Mahmoud Abdulwahid is in Tripoli. He says the situation there remains fragile and there's some scepticism that a lasting deal can be reached.
It's still so fragile, Doreen, this ceasefire, but it seems that what's going on in Berlin is in another, it's going on another path, because there are so many hardliners here on both sides who do not want to stop the fighting. And in fact, the people here, many people here, believe that the Berlin talks are meant to bridge the gap between the countries involved in Libya, not between the Libyan rivals. And now here, for example, the Western camp led by the UN-recognized Prime Minister, Fayez al-Sarraj, they say that they cannot trust Haftar and they cannot make peace with Haftar's camp unless he is tried for what they call the war crimes that have been committed by his forces since April the 4th, since they launched the military campaign to seize Tripoli. There have been so many question marks. They have been addressing these the military camp on the ground, because many military leaders on the ground, they say that they cannot hand over their weapons and they cannot stop fighting until Haftar's forces are pushed out of southern Tripoli. Meanwhile, in the east of the country, the military brigades supporting the warlord Khalifa Haftar, and they have taken control of the oil terminals. They say that they cannot accept any foreign intervention in Libya. They mean the Turkish military assistance to the government of national accord.
Now, the conference in Berlin was also overshadowed by a blockade of Libya's major oil fields by Khalifa Haftar's forces, which is threatening to choke production. In recent months, Libya has been producing 1.2 million barrels per day. As the country's largest export, oil is a financial lifeline for the UN-recognised government in Tripoli. Haftar's allies have shut down 4 oil pipelines, forcing the closure of 2 of the country's largest oil fields. Now, the closures will slash Libya's output by more than 90% to just 72,000 barrels per day. US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo says that he's glad to see progress towards peace, but wants to see Libya's oil pipelines reopened.
There's still a lot of work to do. It's a complicated battlefield, but you had President Erdogan, President Putin, Chancellor Merkel, all making a sincere commitment, Special Representative Salome, who's running the UN, all making a sincere commitment and said, we're going to do this, we're going to reduce risk, we're going to conduct the ceasefire. Still some questions about how well and how effectively can monitor this, but I'm optimistic.